June 15th, 1215. A king, humiliated, abandoned, and out of options, presses his royal seal onto hot wax, authorizing arguably the single most transformative page in human history. The right to fair trial, protection from punishment without due process, the idea that no one, not even a king, is above the law. If any of those sound familiar, the thread runs back to one man, a catastrophic medieval king who accidentally changed everything. Hello, and welcome to Impactful Moments, where we explore some of the most, you guessed it, impactful moments in human history. In this video, we'll discuss King John's terrible rule and the signing of the Magna Carta, one of human rights' most foundational turning points. Power shifts have been the heartbeat of human history. Since the dawn of society, the story has been one of power struggles and consolidation. We began with isolated city-states vying for land and resources, only to see them swallowed by the world's first empire builders, like Sargon of Akkad. From there, the blueprint grew. The Persians, the Han Chinese, and the Romans built massive sprawling machines that governed millions. But while history is often written as a series of wars between empires, a quieter, more internal conflict was always simmering. Who actually owns the law? Humanity has periodically tried to push back against the absolute rule of one man. When the Romans grew tired of the tyranny of their final king, Tarquinius Superbus, they drove him out and forged a republic. In Greece, fed up with the whims of the oligarchs, a series of radical thinkers moved governance toward the world's first democracy. Even on the frozen fringes of the world, when the Vikings settled Iceland, they rejected an absolute crown and established the Althing, a local parliament to settle disputes through consensus rather than decree. Yet, these experiments were fragile. The Greek democracies were eventually swallowed by empires. The Roman Republic collapsed into the rule of the Caesars. And as the world transitioned into the Middle Ages, the representation of the common man seemed to dim. From the Byzantine East to the monarchies of the West, the world was filled with polities that answered to autocrats. In Europe, this took the form of the divine right of the kings, the idea that a monarch was accountable to God alone, and that his word was, quite literally, the law. In England, this absolute power reached its zenith following the Norman Conquest of 1066. Under the Plantagenet dynasty, England had been transformed into a tightly controlled feudal state, where all of the land was determined by the crown. The system relied on a balance. The king provided protection and land, the barons provided taxes and knights. For decades, this contract held firm under ambitious rulers like Henry II and the crusading Richard the Lionheart. But the stability of a kingdom often rests on the personality of the man wearing the crown. And when the charismatic Richard died in 1199, the throne passed to his younger brother, John. Let's talk about John. John was the youngest and thought to be the favorite son of King Henry II, but as the quote-unquote baby of the family, his odds of wearing the crown were quite long. He had 3 older brothers ahead of him in line. He even got the nickname Lackland because his older brothers inherited nearly all of their father's lands. But in the volatile medieval world, 2 of his brothers, Henry the Young King and Geoffrey, had predeceased their father. When Henry II died in 1189, the throne passed to John's only surviving brother, the legendary Richard the Lionheart. Richard spent much of his reign away on the Third Crusade, leaving the kingdom exposed. As he didn't really trust John, Richard promoted the claim of his young nephew Arthur, the son of his deceased brother Geoffrey, as a way of sidelining him. While Richard was fighting in the Holy Land and sitting in prison on his disastrous return from the Third Crusade, John collaborated with King Philip II of France, using messy family politics and opportunistic circumstances to chip away at Richard's continental lands. When Richard returned, he reclaimed his lands and eventually reconciled with John, ultimately even naming him his heir. And when Richard died without a son in 1199, John finally achieved his goal, becoming the master of the Angevin Empire, a cross-channel superpower that stretched from England's border with Scotland to the Pyrenees. He ruled England, the Lordship of Ireland, and a sprawling patchwork of French territories: Normandy, Aquitaine, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. While John's reign is often seen as disastrous, there were three areas in which he truly excelled: burning bridges, making enemies, and losing costly battles. He rebelled against his father despite a close relationship, and against Richard despite gaining control over continental lands. But John's enemy list didn't stop at the English Channel. Though the nobility in England had supported his claim, many of the French territories of the Angevin Empire, which followed different succession rules, backed his nephew Arthur, seeing the young boy as the rightful heir of John's older brother, Geoffrey. This instantly plunged the empire into a succession dispute. King Philip II of France, ever the opportunist, initially backed Arthur, hoping to keep the Plantagenets divided and weak. But then John did something that stunned his own nobility. To avoid a war, he signed the humiliating Treaty of La Goulée with Philip, formally acknowledging him as his feudal overlord for his French lands in exchange for recognition of his titles. But, as noted above, this bridge with Philip was ripe for the burning. In 1200, John annulled his marriage to his first wife and married Isabella of Angoulême. The problem? Isabella was already engaged to Hugh of Lusignan, a powerful French noble. When Hugh appealed to King Philip in 1202, John was summoned to his court in Paris to explain himself. John, still clinging to the idea that he was a sovereign king despite his recent pledge of vassalship, refused to show up. Furious, Philip declared John a contumacious, or defiant vassal, and formally confiscated his continental lands, declaring Normandy, Anjou, and Poitou forfeit to the French crown. John didn't take this lying down, and the two sides went to war. In 1204, John lost the war, and Normandy, which had been under Angevin control for centuries. But to make matters worse, he levied exorbitant taxes to fund his failed campaign, and continued them to defend against a potential French invasion, infuriating his people. John had already fallen out with his barons, his people, his family, and French royalty, and it was now the church's turn. When Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury, died in 1205, the Canterbury clergy appointed a replacement. John, refusing to be sidelined, appointed his own man, Jean de Grey. Both sides appealed to Pope Innocent III to settle the matter, but the Pope rejected both, instead handpicked a scholar named Stephen Langton. Furious at the overreach, John refused to let Langton into the country. In 1208, Pope Innocent responded by placing the entirety of England under an interdict. For over half a decade, the country was largely cut off from the church. Bells were silenced, mass was suspended, and the dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. John doubled down, seizing church lands and revenues to line his own pockets, a move that prompted the Pope to officially excommunicate him in 1209. By 1213, John was a man without a country. Pope Innocent gave Philip of France his blessing to invade England, and the English barons, seeing the Pope turn openly against their king, began to believe that John could be lawfully resisted, and even replaced. Sensing the end, John performed a stunning 180. He didn't just accept Stephen Langton as archbishop, he placed England itself under papal overlordship. By technically handing the keys of the kingdom to the Pope, John turned his greatest critic into his ultimate legal protector. With the church crisis averted, John saw one last chance to put the cherry on top and destroy his reputation, and so he launched another costly and unsuccessful attempt at reclaiming his French territories. In 1214, at the Battle of Bouvines, his dreams were decisively crushed. By this point, John had essentially no support left. His barons, particularly those in the north, were done. They weren't just upset by the exorbitant taxation, they were exhausted by the stifling, distrustful micromanagement John had imposed on the country. They felt like subjects of a tyrant rather than partners in a kingdom. And so, in May 1215, the barons, led by Robert Fitzwalter and Eustace de Vesey, marched on London. Realizing he had no army to protect him, John was forced to the negotiating table in a meadow by the Thames called Runnymede. On June 15th, 1215, John stamped his seal to a document known as the Great Charter, or its more popular Latin name, the Magna Carta. While the ultimate fallout of King John's signing of the Magna Carta sits in the S tier of human rights milestones, the document's initial application was a bit more complicated. The charter was drafted specifically to curb John's unchecked and self-serving decisions. It noted, among many other things, that even the king was not above the law, that citizens couldn't be prosecuted without a fair trial, and that taxes couldn't be levied on the king's whim. But even that didn't go according to plan. You see, John had no intention of honoring the agreement and immediately appealed to Rome to have it overturned. He argued that the document was signed under duress, making it legally invalid. Pope Innocent III agreed, but also likely saw the charter as a massive affront to his own authority. As England's formal feudal overlord, he was incensed that a group of lowly barons would dare to rewrite the laws of a kingdom that technically belonged to the church without his express approval. Consequently, the Pope declared the Magna Carta null and void of all validity forever, effectively giving John a divine green light to ignore the document. When the barons realized that even this tactic didn't work, they were forced to even more desperate measures. During the First Barons' War, they took the radical step of offering the English crown to Prince Louis of France, the son of John's longtime frenemy, Philip. This gamble led to a full-scale French occupation of nearly half the country, leaving John to spend his final months as a fugitive king, frantically attempting to raise armies until he finally succumbed to dysentery in October 1216. With John's death, the primary target of the rebellion was gone. His 9-year-old son, Henry III, was quickly crowned, and his regents, led by the legendary knight William Marshal, reissued a version of the Magna Carta to win back the barons' loyalty. Marshal also led a decisive victory at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, when the French were ousted for good, and England could exhale. The quote-unquote bad King John's rule was so notorious that he has become one of the most recognizable villains in English folklore, even cementing his role as the greedy antagonist in the legends of Robin Hood. But history is rarely that simple. The early English monarchs were a notoriously hot-headed bunch, with a long-standing predilection for brutality. From William the Conqueror's scorched earth harrying of the North and Henry II's role in the murder of Thomas Becket to Richard the Lionheart's ruthless massacre of prisoners at Acre, the kings who preceded John were no stranger to intense actions. What set John apart wasn't necessarily his cruelty, but his lack of redeeming qualities. In the medieval checklist for a good king, you needed to be a successful warrior or a charismatic leader. John was neither. He was a micromanager who lost his lands, a sovereign who surrendered his kingdom to the Pope, and a man whose own barons voluntarily opted for a French invader over his continued rule. And so we got the Magna Carta. Of course, this wasn't an overnight revolution. The Magna Carta didn't instantly topple autocracies. The world would still see centuries more of absolute monarchs, and the 20th century proved that the dictator never truly disappears. But the charter represented the next evolutionary step in the long, arduous climb toward human rights. It joined the lineage of the Code of Hammurabi, the Cyrus Cylinder, and the 12 Tables of Rome. But unlike those ancient codes, which eventually faded with their fallen empires, the Magna Carta achieved something unique: continuity. Since it was reissued following John's death, it has remained a living part of law for over 800 years. It played a monumental role in reintroducing the concept that justice shouldn't depend on the happenstance of a benevolent ruler, shifting the world toward a system where rights were an intrinsic part of government itself. By taking the Viking concept of a consensus-based assembly and forcing it into the heart of the English monarchy, the barons created the DNA for parliamentary sovereignty. From the meeting at the marshy meadows in Runnymede, the foundation of the U.S. Bill of Rights, the core of due process, and the bedrock of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were laid. King John intended the Great Charter to be a temporary lie to save his throne. Instead, it became the most successful accident in the history of human freedom. I hope you enjoyed this video and found this period in history both informative and enlightening. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, and I hope you can join us for another video. Thanks for watching.